In this video, I want to do some speculation about the Arathi lore given to us with the Nightfall event and the accompanying Flames Radiance reputation, as well as a few other Arathi-centric details that I've picked up on with this patch. We're only going to talk about live content, nothing related to 1117 and the Legacy of Arathor quests, just in case you were worried about spoilers. Now, we didn't get any introductory exposition, and the text we did get really doesn't amount to much. But if you saw my first video on the Arathi, then you already know how ready I am to extrapolate detail from just a few lines of world building. That in of itself is something I want to talk about later in the video. You know, world building techniques and how the presentation of the Arathi measures up to their apparent role within the current and future story. But for now, let's just say the bits I've picked up on from the Flames Radiance has pushed me towards an intriguing possibility. Are the Arathi lying to us? But let's go from the top. I'm sure you've heard this before and maybe even feel the same way I do, but the lack of exposition leading into Nightfall, then fighting armies of the Sureki, initially gave me whiplash. I killed Ansurek months ago, and my read on the end of the 11.0 quests was that we had thoroughly resolved that whole situation. But after thinking about it a bit more, considering the scope of the patch, I get it. This is about the Arathi, and we have all the hooks we need to understand what's going on here. Anything meaningful about the Sureki would just dilute the focus of the patch. Unfortunately, this is something that I feel the writers at Blizzard have ended up leaning on a lot lately, and at a certain point, it does just look like they don't have the time, either on screen or in development, to tell the story they want to tell. On the other hand, I'd like to think that we as the audience can be trusted to fill in gaps on things like this, but not to the point that it feels like I'm hallucinating story beats. At least the Nightfall event has very strong flavor. I've missed just having repeatable daily objectives that involve beating up a bunch of NPCs. The gear and cosmetic rewards are just frosting on top. To be fair though, I am biased towards anything involving the Arathi. For all the twists and mysteries built up in the War Within so far, I am far more interested in the Arathi over Xal'atath and the Dark Heart. I think it's because of how grounded they feel as a concept and how easily they can be engaged with for roleplay and other creative writing. It's not that the World Soul A-plot is uninteresting, but Xal'atath and her schemes have been, so far, just another problem to be solved that hasn't really changed the status quo in any meaningful way. Something about still being able to go to Dalaran really sours the impact of Khaz-Algar's intro quests, you know? But the Arathi are a measurable expansion to the setting as a whole, not just in the way they hint at landmasses on the other side of the globe, or from the potential cosmic lore drops we may get from their understanding of magic. It's the simple way that their story is handled, just a slow burn trickle of information that doesn't need to be given to us within a specified period of time. All the same, Blizzard is doing the legwork to establish them. Sometimes it's right in front of you, and other times, it's hidden in plain sight. But this may have just been unintentional, but I think there are parallels we can draw between the relationship between the Arathi and the Earthen versus the humans of Lordaeron and the dwarves of Cosmodan. By the best guesses we can make, the humans and elves who left the old world to found the new Arathi Empire departed some 3,000 years ago, not long after the conclusion of the Troll Wars, while the Earthen of Uldaman did not awaken as dwarves until around 2,500 years ago. It's very likely that the half-elven Arathi had no concept of a flesh dwarf until our arrival in Khaz-Algar, having completely missed out on the same cultural experience that is basically foundational to our concept of the Alliance. But the Arathi have still bonded with the Earthen as quickly as the humans and dwarves of the old world came together. I'm almost a little disappointed it took me so long to see the parallel, but seeing the rebuilt trading depot for the Flames Radiance checkpoint really hammered it home. It would be neglectful not to mention other little references to the side quests and short stories featuring the Arathi, like Etna Blaze being the new prioress. But if you were looking for the consequences to your Lightspark choice, you'll need to head back to the Siren's Isle right over here. But onto the main story feature of the patch, the Flames Radiance. It's a sort of citizen militia, inspired and codified by an event in the Empire's distant past that necessitated the Arathi people to stand and fight under similar circumstances to what they find themselves in now. Their armies stretched thin and their home territory under attack. We have this story presented to us in a book, so let's give that a read before looking further at what inferences we can make about the Empire's history. May the Flames Radiance serve as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, a single torch can burn away the darkness. Long ago, in the age of turmoil and strife, distant enemies moved against our great empire. Determined to meet her enemies head-on, the Empress rallied her armies and summoned every soldier at her disposal. The collected might of the Empire marched off to war, the light of their torches growing dimmer on the horizon, and those left behind found themselves plunged into darkness. With no soldiers or guards to protect them, threats throughout the land encroached upon the vulnerable. As the shadows closed in, it was the old war veterans, soldiers deemed too old or too wounded to march off to war, who lit the first torch. They donned their dusty, faded armor and drew their battle-worn blades, and then they rallied the rest of the common folk. Crafters, farmers, and laborers gathered around to hear their words. The light of the Empress may be distant and faded, but the sacred flame still burns. Darkness may close in now, but we still bear our own flame. We shine with our own radiance. We shall not falter. By the radiance of their flames, both common folk and veterans rallied, holding strong against any threat. Great battles were fought and homesteads were lost, yet in the end, the Arathi persevered. And when their empire's armies returned and their light settled upon battle-scarred homes, the Empress mourned. In her righteous cause to protect the empire from outside threats, she had not seen the darkness that lurked within. With praise, the Empress declared the act carried out by the people one worthy of sanctification. By her hand, she decreed it to be the flame's radiance, an edict sworn to all Arathi, young and old, trained and untrained. Should the light of the Empire for any reason be absent or extinguished, the flame's radiance can be decreed to rally the people and protect the Empire. With this story, I think we can start to put together a timeline for their empire's development and conquest of their unknown continent. This was a period of time in which they were an established empire with significant and existential enemies, but also prior to having airships or any other more efficient means of transporting their armies. I do expect that period to encompass most of their history because of my idea that they achieved a state of total dominance on their continent before exploding academically and culturally. At the same time, I interpret this story to indicate that the threat which demanded the original Flame's radiance was comprised of the same groups as the uprising that General Steelstrike put down to earn her spot with the Hollowfall expedition. It could have been a group of subjugated natives, or some dissident group in the half-elven population. The group we're told about in this Flame's Radiance story had the forces and organization enough to do serious damage to the Empire's infrastructure, and we have seen other human kingdoms come under threat from otherwise endemic but hostile creatures, like the Gnolls against Stormwind, but the perseverance of this enemy speaks to something even more dangerous. It seems entirely plausible that when we go to Avaloran, this group will still be active, which would give a convenient foil to the oppression of the Empire. But it's also just as possible that this dissident group was able to infiltrate the Hollowfall expedition itself. You know, the Order of Night? Their motivations are just as applicable in a remote setting as they would be in the Empire proper. But in my opinion, this book isn't just valuable for the information it presents to us directly. Its existence, alongside the fact that we get the same story told to us directly by one of the Flame's Radiance, clued me into another important factor when looking at what we have learned about the Arathi, as well as both how and where we learned it. Some more context before that. Let's just go over the oral retelling of the Flame's Radiance story. It's a bit less flowery, but more practical. It's a citizen militia. The population of the Hollowfall expedition were all trained military personnel at some point, so it's even easier to call the Flame's Radiance here. It's a little unclear if all Arathi undergo obligatory military training, but given the vibes of how they are presented to us, I would be willing to bet that's the case. I wanted to bring up the oral retelling not just for its own merits, but as a point of comparison to the written text. Both versions give a comforting story for the Arathi to tell themselves, especially in a place like Hollowfall, so far from home, that even in the darkest times, brave people will stand up to whatever darkness comes their way. In a sea of darkness, a single torch wavers, but in a sea of torches, the darkness is consumed. Also, honestly, sometimes it sounds like the land the Arathi came from is often swallowed by darkness in the same way Hollowfall is. That said, Thade's dialogue tells us that it wasn't an oversight to have both a spoken and written account of the Flame's Radiance. It's an intentional choice, so we have to ask, why? Why have both a written and oral account of the background for a militia in such a minor patch? Well, funny thing about that, there's another event in Hollowfall that has a set of both oral and written accounts, but they were partially contradictory. It used to bother me a lot because the only way I could justify it was to say that there was a rewrite mid-war within development. But now, I think we can read between the lines, and we have to ask, do we actually know how the Arathi arrived in Halifal? We are first told about their arrival by Faerun. Actually, no, it was Anduin, in a piece of Stay a While and Listen dialogue at the end of the Isle of Dorn quests. He relays the Earthen's perspective of events, which is that an Arathi armada arrived on their isle some years back, which contradicts the story told to us by Faerun, which is corroborated by Isaiah Strongiron in the Laurel's Crossing School, about the storm, the flash of light, and the teleporting. Not just that, but the entire idea of Faerun being the savior of the flame by clutching it to her chest like it's some limited resource they could have lost. It's all very dramatic. And yet the Earthen's talk of an armada is backed up by the book in the sunken captain's chest southwest of the Priory. This book paints a picture of the Arathi staying in the air above the Isle of Dorn for over a week, to the point that their soldiers were getting restless, before somehow ending up underground. But more importantly, this is a written account. Every other source we have about the expedition's arrival is a story told to us verbally. So what does all that mean? Are the Arathi intentionally lying to us? Can we trust them? Honestly, probably not. You don't create a massive continent-spanning empire without understanding a very important factor of managing your population through faith and belief. It seems like the Arathi are being built up as masters of propaganda. It's not that they're trying to obscure the truth about their arrival or their purpose. They've been fairly upfront about that, and as forthcoming as they can be from a narrative perspective. Instead, it seems to be about enforcing a certain culture and community, which makes sense for a group whose signature weapon, the Sacred Flame, is based in faith and self-assurance. The story of Faerun the Stowaway saving the Sacred Flame is a hell of a lot more inspiring to a stranded population than whatever actually did cause their ships to crash on the rocks after teleporting. There probably was a storm too, but not in the way any of them have told us. I'm inclined to think that this isn't all just high-grade copium, because this wouldn't be the only instance of Blizzard leaving hints and easily overlooked details during the War Within. Something like the difference between Void and Arcane Ethereals only being hinted at in spell effects comes to mind. But I don't think we can do more than speculate about what actually happened at this time, and we may never see this completely cleared up. Instead, I think it's more important that we try to understand the role the Arathi are playing in the story right now, as well as what role this moment is playing in the telling of the Arathi's story. Obviously, they have a place secured in the World Soul saga, with Beledar and Renalash serving as clear hooks to keep the Arathi involved in the World Soul plot overall, which will more or less carry its own weight for the next few years. But after Midnight and Last Titan, Metzen has talked about their plans for the game's distant future in broad terms in a way that speaks to the same interconnected narrative we expect to see during the World Soul saga. But the time to start establishing those plotlines is now, and I think that heavily informs the way we're seeing the Arathi presented. In things like TV shows and movies, you can often find examples of stories that start with a planned end, but because of capitalism, these IPs get extended to absurdity, and for some reason the writing teams are just incapable of capturing the same spark initially set by a beloved franchise. It's because of a lack of planning. In an environment where the writers don't know how many episodes, or expansions, they have left, each story has to act with its own self-contained plot and simultaneously leave room for future stories while also not creating a dissatisfying narrative in the moment. Warcraft has largely taken an alternative route with something more in line with comic books, where you have a villain of the week story structure with few changes to the status quo. It's not surprising to see them gearing up for more ambitious stories now that they have committed to a more connective narrative between expansions. So yeah, the Arathi? I'm sure every WoW player with a mind for the story can clock their continent as a target for a future expansion. And hey, that's a good thing. Enabling foreshadowing isn't a mistake. Blizzard doesn't need to hide it, and honestly, shouldn't try to be creative and tricky by secretly building them up in the background. One day they're gonna have to sell us their lands as an expansion target, and they need to not have the same reaction they got to the Jailer and Zareth Mortis. But over the course of the saga, I expect we'll see their history and characters built up more and more so that in 14.0, or maybe sometime beyond that, when we go to see their lands in person, we'll be a lot more informed about what to expect there. More so than even Kaz Algar and its hints from the Old Man books. Maybe we'll know more about the dragons and other fauna on their continent by then. Or even in Midnight, with the reunion of the scattered elven tribes, we could get some more dialogue about the Arathi's encounters with the Naga, or the Naga's encounters with the Arathi. We can already see the outline of some of the revelations heading our way with the Dimensional Codex, even if the writing to delay that information isn't the most clever out there. Having all of their mages just so happen to die in the crash, but conveniently leaving one alive just to give us a taste. Actually, now that I think about it, the narrative we have for how their mages died may be another half-truth. I'm sure they died during the Armada's transposition underground, but I'm thinking it wasn't Belladar that teleported them below ground at all, and it wasn't kinetic impact that killed the mages. I think they may have been the ones to cast the teleportation spell and burned out from overexertion in doing so. But besides that, I'm also curious to learn more about the Arathi's history with using the light in combat. They distinctly have paladins, which isn't something that we learned to do in the old world until the First War. By any measure, I think we can assume that the Arathi developed similar techniques much earlier, which strengthens the idea that the enemies they were fighting were using dark magics, since it was Orc Warlocks and Death Knights that inspired our innovation with the light. But that's all from me for today. If you enjoyed this video, check out my first video on the Arathi for a few other wild observations. Take it easy, have a good week, and I'll see you in the next video.